Hey everybody, it's T with the UFOs Want to Tell You Something. This week's episode is part 2 to last week, so UFOs and Paranormal Part 2. This week we got some odd cases, and we're going to go over those and take a deep look into it. So, let's do it. So about 2 years ago, I'm looking for some books online. Usually I do that. eBay's pretty good because they have a lot of out-of-print stuff, a lot of older stuff, and a lot of harder to find stuff. Sometimes you can get it for a reasonable price, but there's a lot of scalpers. Now, I'm looking for something interesting, I'm just kind of shuffling through, see what I can find, and I come across the International UFO Reporter. Now, that's an old magazine. They used to publish it, they don't anymore. They've got a lot of good stories in them. Now, I'm going through them, and I come across one specific one that just strikes my attention immediately. Now, if you'll recall from my last couple episodes, right, on the UFOs Want to Tell You Something on podcast number 3, when I go into some of the dreams and why it's called that, you'll recall my bedroom light incident. Now, I'm not talking about the sleep paralysis one where there was the blue light that came into the room and my body started vibrating, including my teeth, so like in a weird way. No, not that one. We're talking about the little ball of light that flew toward my face and turned into a gray alien's face. That's the one I'm referring to. Where I was dreaming and then I woke up within the dream to have that happen and then wake up again. So a dream within a dream. But this one stood out to me, this International UFO Reporter magazine, because there's a story in there about a bedroom light. And on the very front cover, which I'll post on my Facebook, is an illustration of a bedroom light. Now, little did I know at the time, doing research, I had never heard of this, but apparently back in the 1980s, a lot of British people and abductees were experiencing that. And I find that very odd. Now, I don't connect a parallel where I say that I'm an abductee or even had that experience. But I do find it odd and, in this case, very synchronistic. A meaningful coincidence. Please excuse the wind in the background, by the way. Alright, so this one's called Bedroom Light by Irina Scott. PhD psychologist, Ohio State Medical School. So this is from 1988, March/April, International UFO Reporter. If you get on my Facebook, you can see a picture of it. I posted it on there. So here we have a psychologist, not just writing things off. And interestingly enough, she doesn't go to a paranormal kind of aspect with this. She links it to a UFO related one. So in the article, she starts off by referring to a MUFON journal from that same year, February of 1988, where she's talking about an article Jenny Randles has put out. Now, people are familiar with Jenny Randles. She's done a lot of abduction research, a lot of UFO research. She's kind of a big name out there. Now, in the article that she's referring to, Jenny Randles mentions the presence of small balls of light often seen in the bedroom whilst the abductee is a child. Now, in the 1980s, this was a reoccurring feature of British abductions. But the author also notes that she's neither British, nor is she from the British Isles. Rather, she's from a small town in Ohio, on a small farm. Now, this story happened to the author and her sister. I'm going to do a lot of quotes in here from her, because I like the first-hand accounts better. They add a little more validity. You get the honest story from the person, and she wrote it, so we're going to go into some of those. The observation took place near the 4th of July, 1949 through 1951. My best guess would be 1951. The incident occurred between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock p.m. Her sister's name was Sue Postal. They shared the same attic room upstairs, but their beds were opposite of each other. Now, normally they would go to bed around 8, and their parents usually remained downstairs in the living room. They would read and listen to the radio. At that time, people didn't have TVs a whole lot. They were kind of expensive. So people would listen to the radio or just read books or magazines. And their parents were very strict with what they listened to on the radio and what kind of magazines they read, so they were not familiar with the UFO phenomena at all. She goes on to state, I don't remember that anything unusual happened before the event. It was dark and I had fallen asleep. Then slowly awakened to a small, around 5 to 22 millimeter glowing object flying around the room. In color and appearance, it resembled incandescent metal, such as one would find in a blacksmith shop. The object slowly circled the room in a meandering motion. The walls on the east and the west sides of the attic room slanted toward the ceiling. The object weaved vertically and laterally as it slowly circled the room. Then I realized that its path appeared to show guidance. It always turned before it got to a wall or other object. I don't recall it going in reverse, and I believe it always moved forward. It flew slowly, and as I remember, it circled the room 3 times. Several times it came quite close to me. The object did not change in shape, size, or brightness. I thought Sue was asleep, so I didn't say anything to her. After I watched it for between 2 to 6 minutes, it flew, as I recall, in a straight line from the south end of the room to the chandelier, which was in the center of the ceiling, and was shut off at the wall switch. Now, without touching the chandelier, she notes it circled between the walls. She notes that as it did this, it no longer meandered, but rather did a tight circle. While it did this, it stayed merely inches away from the chandelier, and it circled it 25 to 35 times, never straying from the concentric circle it was making. Next, it slowly spiraled downward. It spiraled in a perfect geometric fashion, with the spiral becoming smaller as it decreased in altitude. It had spiraled so that it was directly below the center of the chandelier. It made a noise, and I saw lights coming from it. I concluded that it had exploded. The author then ran downstairs terrified. As she did this, she noticed that behind her sister was also running. They came barreling down the stairs, and they both hit each other's heads together, and then rolled into the door. Now finally opening the door and recuperating themselves, they ran screaming to their parents. Their parents didn't believe them, and their father threatened to whoop them and put them back upstairs if they didn't go to bed. Too terrified to enter the room, the 2 children just stood at the door. So their mother asked their father to go look at the room, check it out. He found nothing odd. The next day, the author, her mother, and the sister spoke about the incident. I thought I remember that Sue said she watched the object move around outside the window for a while, as if it were looking in, and then it came right through the window. She then later asked her sister about this again in 1984. Sue said that she had woke up first and saw it in the room. Sue's recollections were as followed. This happened when I was around 6 to 9 years old. I was born in 1944. It was summer. My sister and I slept in the same room, but in different beds. It was probably around 9 to 11. I had been asleep, or nearly so, and I became aware of a bright little light flying around the room, not like a lightning bug, much bigger and moving differently. I watched it, I suppose trying to figure out what it was. Then I realized my sister was watching it too. We became afraid and both ran downstairs to Mom and Dad as fast as we could. They were still awake, as I remember, and they thought we were nuts. Sue goes on to state that her mother believed that the author of the story, Irina, was telling scary stories and they both imagined it. Sue's reply to this is, I'm sure that wasn't true. because I had been asleep, and it just wasn't something that I had imagined. I remember most of all being scared. I saw the object circle the lamp, but I didn't see it change in appearance or make a noise. It was the color of an ordinary light bulb, and as big as a ping-pong ball. It was yellowish and white. The next recollection is the mother's. My recollection of this occurrence is quite faint, as it happened several years ago. My husband and I were reading when Irina and Sue had gone to bed. All of a sudden, the girls hit the closed stairway door, and both of them bolted into the room screaming. They said something came into the window, and a light traveled around the room 2 to 3 times, as I can remember. And then it disappeared. They were scared, and watched it until it disappeared, and then they ran downstairs. They were very frightened, and we had no explanation for it. The event must have left quite an impression because several of our other relatives still remember it. For example, a cousin recalled that he was afraid to stay in the room by himself. Now, because her parents still live in the house, the author was able to investigate a little further. I do not know how the object entered the room. The room had only one window, which was screened, and 2 doors. She then describes how the downstairs was still closed, the door, and the other just opened into another room, with another screened window. Neither window's screens had holes in them at all. In comparison to a firefly, the object was on continuously for several minutes, had a color different from a firefly's, and didn't move up and down in a pattern of lightning bug. There were no swamps around, so she writes off swamp gas. It's not a ball of lightning due to the night, because it was clear. Ball lightning doesn't stay around for, 2 to 6 minutes either. But she goes on to state and note that there were trees out front, so any time a storm would occur, her mother would bring them downstairs. Because the trees were quite close, and I suppose she was afraid of it falling on the house or something, Which makes a lot of sense. It showed complex guided trajectory. It responded to its surroundings at a distance without touching them. And it acted as if it were aware of the size and shape of the room. It did not guide itself along the electric wires of the wall. There were wires at the top of the ceiling going from a wall switch to the chandelier, and then to another chandelier in the next room, under wallpaper and plaster. The chandelier in their room had been shut off. The object didn't follow the wires. The object meandered while avoiding the walls. It did not guide itself along anything. Even taking into account new theories such as fifth and sixth forces and antimatter, there is no basis that I know of to hypothesize that the object's deflection because the object moved close to or away from the walls, furniture, and me as I turned my foot, just inches distance. But it did not collide with anything. There have been no electrical problems in the room in the years since. The object gave no evidence of a propulsive system, such as when it flew into the chandelier and circled it. It did not leave a trail, and it made no noise as it flew. I probably watched the object for several minutes. Sue became aware of me watching it, thus may have watched it for a longer period of time than I did. We don't know how long it had been in the room before we awakened. We also cannot explain why we ran from the room at approximately the same time. Now, this is a very odd story. It doesn't have a whole lot of parallels with mine, other than the object I had seen from awaking from a dream into another dream was about the size of a ping pong ball, color of a light bulb, and it shot directly at my face and turned to a gray alien's face. That didn't seem to happen here. But notice, with this lady did here. Now, she didn't jump to boogaloos and ghosts, right? She went straight to the UFO phenomena. Why she did that, a little odd, I don't understand it, but it's because it showed guidance and it was outside the window first. This tells me that maybe she has experienced this before and doesn't remember. Now, that's a possibility, but she also states that she just doesn't remember any of it, which I think would have come up by now. Now, this has got to be one of my favorite stories, because that lady, she fucking booked it out right there at the end. If you caught what I was saying, I know I'm kind of a bad reader, but what she did was she investigated it. She was looking for fucking wires in the walls and trying to check it out, making sure nothing had happened electrically that would cause that. That's the scientific way you should do it, not just chalk it up to that's a ghost and probably a fucking Bigfoot in the ball of light trying to get me. Now again, this story was pretty synchronistic for me, just because of the dream I had had. Seeing the ball of light on that picture, it really struck me. It's a meaningful coincidence. I like it. I like this story. And again, something you should take away from this, just like I said in the last episode, you can't chalk everything up to the paranormal. It's way too easy to do that. I mean, we'd be able to write everything off if we were able to just say, okay, an alien walked through the wall because he's an interdimensional person. I mean, we can't... It's so boring to look at things that way as well. But again, think logically. Like this woman tried to do. She tried to tear it down and think of different possibilities. So, if you guys think it was something else, and it very well could have been, go ahead and email me, message me on Facebook, something. I want to see what you guys think. Me personally, I think chalking it up to a ufological area on this makes a lot of sense. But I want to hear from you guys. So this case is from Brad Steiger's, one of his older books, The UFO Abductors. Now, this is a really weird case. And I think during the end I'm going to try to break it down my way and kind of see what comes out of it. Because, like I said, it's an odd one. It's called A Game of Wizards. Now, at the end, you're gonna find this weird kind of theory, and then it's all gonna kind of come together, in my opinion, that changes my perspective on it, to be honest with you. So where the whole thing seems paranormal, one of his ending statements kind of draws a more scientific way of looking at things, in my opinion. We begin our enigmatic story in April of 1972. Bill Fogarty was 20 years old. He was a junior at University of Indiana at South Bend. He saw a UFO. He was part of a group that, together, once a week, would talk about politics, philosophy, and many other subjects. On one bewitchingly strange night, someone brought up the enigmatic subject of UFOs. On that very night, Fogarty and 4 others would witness a low UFO overflight. Brad Steiger reports, Fogarty assured me that the 5 were all students physically fit, non-drinkers, non-dopers, and 2 were Vietnam combat veterans. Each of them prided himself on maintaining a cool, analytical approach to all aspects of life, especially toward anything that smacked of the occult and the bizarre. Each respective man asserted the object was unmistakably odd in the sky and could not be written off as a conventional aircraft nor an ordinary celestial body like a bird or a comet or anything like that. 4 nights later, 2 of the 5 men had seen another UFO. The next evening, Fogarty and 2 others, the same 2 that saw the UFO from before, saw a brilliantly glowing object. It was overhead as they returned from a movie at 1 o'clock. It was a short time after that the 5 had a group sighting of a UFO, and it began thereon to have nightly sky watches. Fogarty goes on to say, "We all witnessed UFOs converting in the midnight sky." Fogarty goes on to say, "On one occasion, I stood within 10 feet of 2 nocturnal lights hovering silently in the air. Later, we heard rapping in the dark, hollow voices, heavy breathing, and crushing footsteps, unseen entities. Strangely enough, we were able to maintain our cool towards the phenomena occurring around us," he said, smiling. Maybe we got to thinking that we had been chosen for some special kind of interaction. Perhaps, secretly, we were beginning to view ourselves as masters of 2 worlds. I mean, we were all Dean's List students, all athletic young men, normally balanced emotionally and sexually. The men had assumed that they could deal with this rationally and stay in control of the situation. But Fogarty goes on to note a strange, odd change, violent in nature. They swept through the home of one of the group members one night, pounding on the walls, yanking furiously on his bedpost, striking the startled young man in the face, terrorizing his entire family. Some of the group were followed by unmarked automobiles that seemed a bizarre mixture of styles and models, phantom automobiles, if you will. Within the next few months, the number of harrowing incidents increased and expanded to include strange, dark-clad, nocturnal visitors in the apartments of several group members. Radios and television sets switched on and off by themselves. Doors opened and closed, although, when tested, they were found to have remained locked. One group member made the odd and wild claim of being teleported in the middle of the forest on the outskirts of the city from his room. As preposterous as it sounds, I'm sure that most of us expected it was true, Fogarty goes on to say, since we all undergone some incredible experiences. We had all lost perspective. I had started sleeping with the 38 special under my pillow. He then goes on to state that one of his friends invested heavily in weapons and began running with a group of, that offered sacrifices to Odin. One of his friends became a born-again fundamental Christian, and the other 2 dropped out of college, only with a month left. They were about to graduate with honors. Fogarty goes on to say, "I thought a lot about what all this meant. I think the 5 of us had entered some kind of game, a contest, a challenge, a testing experience. The trouble was we just didn't know the rules." He then talks about how modern society does not prepare people for kind of odd experience like this, or that there is another reality around them. Our educators have ignored the individual mystical experience and the other dimensions that can open up to those who enter altered states of consciousness, whether it be through drugs or accidentally stumbling into twilight zones. I had the feeling that my friends and I were dealing with some kind of energy. At first, I thought I was something from outer space, some alien world. But I've thought out our experiences a great deal over the past 11 years, and I believe that we somehow activated some energy that is part of this planet. I think we may have triggered some kind of archetypal patterns within our minds. Maybe that's what magicians have tried to do since Cro-Magnon days. Interact with and control that energy within our minds. Brad Steiger goes on to ask, how had such intelligent, resourceful young men lost control? Why had they ended up paranoid, frightened, and converted? Fogarty goes on to reply, because we aren't magicians, obviously. We had no idea just how deadly serious the game could become. It really is a game of wizards. Not for some smart-ass college students who believe that their brilliant intellects and their physics books can provide an answer for everything. Now, an odd story indeed. Oddly, this doesn't feel like your typical close encounter story, right? Like your Lonnie Zamora's, your Cash Landrum, it doesn't feel like those typical scenarios. So what that implies to me, first off, is that this is possibly a different phenomenon. Although they did see UFOs on multiple different occasions, and there's quite a few parallels, but the whole thing overall sounds more poltergeisty, right? But the question is, does it necessarily have to be poltergeist? So let's break down a couple of the weird things that happen there. So, we got the UFOs, linked with the UFO phenomena. Dark-clad entities. Well, they didn't really go into a very good description of what they looked like, or really at all. But dark-clad entities, yeah, that lines up. Like I said before, they're often sometimes reported in black robes and things like that. Turning on radios and TVs. Well, as we've gone over, and is very common out there with the UFO phenomena, they can affect your electronics, like shutting off your car. So I find this possible too, That's electronical stuff. Could be technology messing with stuff, rather. I could see that. Teleportation. You see, I know what you're thinking and where I'm going to go with this one, and I'm not going there. Where I would go with this is when he teleported from his room into the middle of the forest. Was time missing? I don't really buy into teleportation all that much, so I want to go over the fact of, was he missing time? Was he actually abducted? That's just a theory and a question, but I think a feasible one. Honestly, I would have handled asking some of these questions a little differently than Brad Steiger. I do like his work, but again, he has that same issue of being 14. So what I mean by that is you're looking into so many things that you're tying the parallels in when they may not actually exist. Invisible entities, hollow voices, and heavy footsteps and breathing. Well, again, that's poltergeisty. That's not often reported with abductions. But theoretically, they would have the technology to go invisible. I mean, even in modern times, we're working on that now. If you've seen the newest Hollow Man movie, or The Invisible Man, it happens in there, right? It's just a suit that reflects what's behind you and makes you kind of appear invisible. Opening and closing locked doors. That one's a little odd. I can't explain that one. So let's compare with the poltergeist phenomenon now and see which one this story fits in a little better. Invisible entities, poltergeist. Moving locked doors, opening and closing them, poltergeist. Turning off radios and TVs, poltergeist. Hitting people, poltergeist. Hollow voices, heavy footsteps, and breathing, poltergeist. So quite frankly, this has more in common with a poltergeist than it does the UFO phenomenon. The only real correlation would be seeing the UFOs and the black-clad entities, which also could be poltergeist phenomena. The black-clad entities, not the UFO. Now, that's just my interpretation of things, right? But it's an alternative perspective for you. Now, here's a big one for me. Let's say these are interdimensional beings. They can come through your walls, they can just open and close doors and things like that. It's the same argument I made on the last podcast. Why the fuck would they need a UFO? If they can open a portal into your room and merely take you through that, why would they take you onto a UFO? Why would they need UFOs for transportation when they can just teleport to your room? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. So I would argue that this one's more of a poltergeisty phenomenon. Now here's another question. Are these ufonauts picking up on the energy from said poltergeist and simply observing it? Again, UFOs are well known for being over volcanoes that are about to erupt or erupting, earthquakes, and other phenomena like that produces a lot of energy. Are they simply watching and observing these odd situations? Just a couple of thoughts for you to think about. Now you can link the two together if you'd like. I don't care. It's just, I want to give you an alternative perspective, and I want you to think for yourself and not loop everything into the paranormal, like I was saying. Now, I'm going to keep kicking that dead horse until we start to look at things that way. UFO occupants seem to speak to you through your mind. They can alter your perceptions. Hell, in fact, that could be another point just for how they perceive them as invisible. Right? Altered perceptions. But maybe this is all psychic phenomena. Maybe it's psychic phenomena as a result of the UFO occupants rather than a poltergeist or anything like that. Now, the next story we're going to go over is Pat from Taken, Dr. Carla Turner's book. Now, we all know how I feel about Dr. Carla Turner. I love her work. I think she does some of the best work. And this is a story I've mentioned in at least 5 of my podcasts out of the 6 that we've done already. This is number 6. And this is the story I keep bringing up. And we may go into some more stories as well. Obviously, we will. But this is the story of Pat, with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus and his angels. And what this is going to demonstrate is the altered perception theory. It's an odd one, and we're going to bust into it. Dr. Carla Turner starts by stating that she met Pat through a mutual acquaintance. The acquaintance heard Pat's UFO story and suggested that she get a hold of Dr. Carla Turner. Pat lived in Florida and was 50 years old, divorced mother with a grown child. But the event to be spoken of, the very notable one, occurred in 1954 in Floyd Knob, Idaho. Pat's memory of the event, as in the case of so many other people, was totally suppressed after the occurrence. It all came flooding back into her consciousness in 1986. Scenes of brilliant orange ball of light, little gray entities both inside and outside the farmhouse, and most disturbing of all, military personnel on the property. I thought, I must be crazy when these memories came back. But they were so strong and real. I finally got in touch with my brother and sister, and asked if they recalled anything similar. My sister Rose said she recalled the aliens and the military people too. But although my brother didn't recall the orange ball of light, he clearly remembered the military personnel and some of the interactions with them. Through extensive conversations, letters, and drawings from Pat and her siblings, the following extraordinary scenario emerged, raising serious questions not only about the nature of alien abduction agenda, but also the involvement of the military citizens who have been a target of such interactions as well. We begin this strange tale on a 6-acre farm in Floyd's Knob, Indiana. In the summer of 1954, 11-year-old Pat lived there with her mother, stepfather, grandma, brother, who was 9 at the time, and sister, who was 6. On one particular night, several family members saw a large, strange ball of light appear outside the farmhouse. Pat was already asleep, but was awakened by either her sister or her grandma to look out the window. What they saw was a large orange ball of light motionless in the sky, then rapidly move around the back of the house. I remember vaguely thinking, I will go back to bed and wait. It seems to me that I knew they were coming. I saw my mother running to the kitchen door to make sure it was locked, and see the ball of light came over the yard. I remember thinking, it won't do any good to lock the doors. They can come in anyway. It was if I knew what to expect. Pat became tired and sleepy, but she didn't remember going to bed. The next memory is an odd, enigmatic, multicolored light, slowly spinning around the room in silence, spewing blue, purple, and violet hues. She got out of the bed and walked to the window to see a gray floating just outside. Look at those eyes, she thought. They can film us. The gaze of the gray seemed to penetrate her entire being, and she seemed to have sensed a familiarity with him. Don't be afraid, it communicated to Pat. You are the chosen child. We will not harm you. As Pat turned around, she witnessed several white, tall entities coming into the room. They floated her grandmother out the door, and Pat could feel the old woman's terror, and she felt fear herself. The room was filled with strange beings, with a huge beam of light sparkling like it came through the ceiling. In that light is what Pat perceived to be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, in a radiant robe. He took Pat's right hand and stated, Don't be afraid, my child, these are mine, gesturing to the beings that stood amidst the room. The Jesus figure would again address Pat by stating, I am the light of the world. And then again, sparkling shaft of light returned, and he ascended into the ceiling with the beam of light, and they disappeared. She and her grandmother were then floated out of the room by the entities. Passing her mother's bedroom, Pat saw a brilliant white light emitting from the room. 5 taller white entities were around her stepfather, examining his legs. As a result of polio, he had atrophied either one or both of his legs. Examining the man's legs with a green bar of light around 5 inches long that floated over the man. As they continued on through the house, out into the yard, Pat witnessed a craft, crystalline in appearance and hovering low to the ground. A beam erupted out of the bottom of the craft, engulfing her. I remember my sister's blonde curly head next to mine as we went up the craft. We were looking down at the ground and saw my mom and grandma. They were looking up like zombies. She also saw that the yard was filled with greys, hurrying about the area. Neither Pat or her sister Rose is certain of the exact sequence of events. They both recalled a group of smaller gray beings near a ditch beside the cellar door. Rose remembers the beings in a line walking across the board spanning the ditch. Pat remembers a line, or wall of fire, in the ditch, and a row of small gray skinny aliens wearing Chinese rice paddy hats with big brims. I was on one side of the ditch, and they were on the other. They were telling me, pass through the light, it will not hurt you. Which I was thinking at the time that I would get burned. The fire was not hot, and it was supposed to cleanse me. I did go through it, to the other side. I don't remember doing it, or what happened after. After the light transported her and Rose into the craft, Pat sat on a table with the Greys present. A taller white came over with a file-type instrument, and he scraped the skin from her inner forearm and the bottoms of her feet, clipped off some of her hair, and peeled away some samples of her fingernails. What do you need all those pieces of me for? She said. We are making a new you, the abductor replied. Pat asked, Are you an angel? Yes, but not like you have been taught, replied the visitor. Pat was taken into another room with the table, where she is laid down. Above the table was a dark instrument. One of the Greys pulled down the tube from the device. At the end of the tube was a thin needle. Pat became frightened and was told, This is the part you don't have to remember, replied one of the abductors. Pat knew it would be put into her right nostril, but she passed out before it happened. She recalled another part of her physical exam being fused with a silver light. It was done from something over my body. Up high in the room, he, the alien, fused me into my head with a silver light. It will keep me from violent harm. It let me be perfect in human form for a few seconds. It was a protective light. I get the idea that when this silver light goes into my other body, I will be made the new me. In other words, the new me will come to life with my soul in it. Pat came back to awareness again, after the incident with the needle, to find herself back in the first room once more. On a table again, crying because she couldn't stay with the Greys. "It isn't time yet," replied one Grey. She asked for a souvenir, as proof that it really had occurred. The green healer rock above her stepfather. It would not work properly for her. Only for them, they said. She was then told, "You are going to have to forget this." "Why?" cried Pat. "Because there are those who would tamper with your mind," the Grey replied. Pat was then returned to her house, where she saw all her family members sitting in the living room in a daze like zombies. Even her stepfather. He was propped up, leaning against the sofa. She was placed back in her bed, saw one of the Greys outside her window, once more gesturing farewell to her. She responded with a wave and drifted off to sleep immediately again. Now this is just one story from Taken by Dr. Carla Turner, and honestly, I think per week, instead of the whole Nick Redfern thing, I think we'll go over part of the story every week for each of these abductees. Pat's got an awful long story, and that blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus comes up again. So, once a week, we're going to do a little bit of part of each story of these abductees. Well, let's break it down. So, the alien outside the window is commonly reported. Not in every case, but in some. I've heard plenty of them. That's rich within the lore. We have the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. Now, Pat, if you watch some of Dr. Carla Turner's lectures and watch her speak about this, Pat was a very religious woman. And still is, as far as I know. I don't know that anything has come of Pat since then, if she's even still alive. But she's very religious. Now, as I've gone over in all the other podcasts, this altered perception theory is they produced a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus to make it more comfortable for her to go. And if you notice, they stuck with the religious theme. Again, that's because it's easier for her to accept that. It makes it more willing for her to go with them this time and later on. Now, the green rod over her stepfather, that could be technology. Now, one of the parts I do find odd is her perception was altered differently than her sister Rose. Because Rose, her sister, witnessed them walking in a line along the ditch. Now, while she witnessed them walking in a line along the ditch as well, she also saw light or fire in the middle of the ditch, and they were also wearing hats like Raiden from Mortal Kombat. So, in this case, they altered her perception a little more. For the reason, I don't know. It seems to be the fire part and being cleansed by it was, I don't want to call it a metaphor, but it's almost sticking with that religious viewpoint. Her sister was 6, and she's not really going to understand that. So that could explain part of that. So another odd part is the clone talk, right? I really don't know what to make of that. It could be this hybrid program that people talk about, and they could be playing off of that, saying, here's a new body you're going to have, and it's going to have your soul. If you'll notice when she's talking about that, she refers to the light being fused with her. So, technology could be a needle being inserted or something odd like that. And she feels like the perfect human. Now, this is my interpretation of this, is that, again, it makes it easier for the next time go around. Earlier, the Grey told her you're the chosen one, the chosen child. Well, that's common with abductions too. People get told that a lot. In fact, Whitley Strieber got told that and he called bullshit on it. Because if he was chosen, why is there so many other people around? It's almost like a dog being given a treat with this perfect human thing, right? So it's, if you act good, we're going to make you feel better. You'll feel like the perfect human. Now, again, that's just my interpretation of it, but that's what I walk away from this with. Now, the part where it talks about her being kept from violent harm with said light, I don't know what to make of that. Again, that could be an instrument that almost nullifies any anger or anything like that. I'm not 100% sure. But that's what I make of this whole situation. Where some others would jump off the bat, and just go crazy with it, like all of this literally happened. There was literally a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. They literally somehow appeared to Pat and Rose in two separate ways at the same time, and it was all a religious experience. Well, again, you have to look at things differently. You can't just jump the gun and say everything's paranormal, right? As you can see, there's a couple things I didn't know about, but I still tried to break it down in a rational way. And that's kind of what I mean with this whole thing. So if there's anything you take from my podcast, this UFOs and the paranormal ones, take that from it. Now, that being said, I want to take a bit of a jumping off point with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus aspect. Now, nowadays, a lot of religious people, and I have nothing against religious people, right? I was raised Christian. But a lot of religious people nowadays have this big conspiracy, that's what we're going to call it, that these extraterrestrials are demons. So they're going to take your soul and they're going to rape and beat you. And if you cry out the name of Jesus, the abduction stops. In more of Dr. Carla Turner's work, as well as many others, this is proven wrong. You can take a look back at the Betty and Barney Hill case. Okay? Barney Hill was looking up at that craft. He saw the entities and it freaked him out. And he cried out for God to stop it. And it did not stop. When people are abducted, the same situation happens. People will cry out the name of Jesus. Some have reported that it does stop, others have not. And I'm sorry, I don't just buy into the fact that if you're a believer, it stops, and if you're not, it doesn't. I don't buy that. The fact of the matter is, it acts two separate ways. I remember I was doing some research, and I looked into this perspective, right? And I'm listening to a podcast from a guy, and the podcast was titled, Why UFOs Are Most Certainly Demons, or something to that effect. And then as I'm listening, because he sounded very, stern on the fact, like he knows what he's talking about. As I start to listen, within the very first few minutes, and I can respect this man for this, he comes out and he says, I'm sorry that the title was a little misleading. What I meant was, some abduction cases seem to be demonic rather than aliens. Not in all cases, and then he pointed out the Betty and Barney Hill example. Another man I heard quote this same story from Pat and then say that aliens were mutilating and murdering children and babies so they could occupy the soul and steal the body. In one case from this man, he talked about aliens carving not only a cross into a person's body, but a pentagram and the Star of David, and he said it was like a ritual, and they were marking him. Now that's a little out there, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. You see, I'm going to tell you right now, aliens are not demons. We pointed out in the last episode just an example of how succubus and incubus are completely different than the extraterrestrials and this phenomena. Now that very well could be the case. There very well could be demons, and they could be attacking people, but it is not this phenomena. So I want you to keep that in mind anytime you hear somebody say that calling out the name of Jesus stops an alien abduction. There are many religious people who cannot stop an abduction by calling out the name of Jesus. Even if you're faithful, it's like me being ready to get stabbed. And I say, "Oh, Jesus, help me," and he stabs me anyway. This universe, physical harm can still come to you, and it will in most cases. I just wanted to make a little point of that, because this does go on with UFOs and the paranormal. They're not demons. They may even play on your emotions to make it easier for you to go with them. But they have a specific plan. I don't know what it is, but it's something specific. Now, more on that. So, let's say UFOs landed on the White House lawn today. Occupants got out, waved, said, "How you doing?" People are going to be fucking picketing them and calling them demons, trying to throw rocks and shit at them. That's unfortunately the world we live in, and people will look at this in different ways. Again, UFOs plus ghost plus Sasquatch plus Loch Ness Monster equals UFOs. We shouldn't be so quick to buy into all of these things. You have to look at it objectively, as I've been saying and probably repeated at least 15 times between the two goddamn podcasts. Now, there is something else I wanted to go over. So in the last podcast, I talked about the man who communicated with Palladians through a radio and through a Ouija board, and he never saw a UFO. That was one of Nick Redfern's articles. Well, as I did a little more research, I found that Preston Dennett did a whole video on Ouija boards and UFOs. And there seems to be some cases out there. So here's my rationality of this. Let's say it's possible. Because he did find some cases of it, so let's say it's possible. How is it possible? Now he notes a couple cases where they're talking through a Ouija board to what appears to be extraterrestrials, and they say, "Meet me at this point in time and you'll see us." And then they do and see a UFO. What if that's psychic phenomena as well? Maybe whenever you get on a Ouija board, now I don't know much about them admittedly, but let's say anytime you get on the Ouija board and you start interacting, perhaps your thoughts are being able to be read. vaguely familiar with it to a certain degree, to the point of you ask a question, it gets answered, right? So perhaps they're interacting that way, being able to do it through your mind. I mean, these beings seem to be telepathic. They can alter our perceptions. I could see them being able to communicate through a Ouija board to a degree. Maybe they're moving your hand subconsciously, for all I know. That is an oddity. I cannot explain all of it, but I still am not going to say therefore paranormal. I would try to find a rational cause to it, and I think that's a pretty damn good way to do it. Now, on that note, I'm going to go into some other weird shit that I've heard. So I was listening to a podcast from Mike Cleland recently, where he was talking with Micah Hanks on the Gralien Report, and they go into synchronicities. Now, when you start listening to Mike Cleland talk, and I don't mean to bag Mike Cleland, he seems like a very nice man. By the way, I said he lived in Colorado. I was wrong about that. He does live in a place with an abundance of animals and the wilderness. And he notes a lot of things that come off as coincidence to me. And he talks in one case about how he longed for a kiss with this woman that he had met. They were camping, and just hanging out and barbecuing, and then 5 owls appeared. Actually, I don't think it was 5, but some owls appeared. And then he got an email from somebody saying the same thing and how they longed for a kiss. And he connected that as synchronicity. Well, I gotta say, that one right there is going to be more coincidence, in my opinion. I think he said that they were talking about the existence of God when the owls appeared. Now, okay, you can talk about synchronicities and stuff like that, but you need to realize when synchronicities are coincidence, kind of like I try to do. Again, they're meaningful coincidences. And then he spoke about a theory that he had heard that aliens can be up in their little UFO somewhere and control owls. And I don't know if he buys into that, but I'm going to call that one a little ridiculous. In fact, that's a hard one. I am going to call that ridiculous. Most definitely. And now that I'm thinking about it with the Ouija board thing, going back to that, I would argue that maybe they don't control our hands. Perhaps that's a different phenomenon as well. I'm not really too sure. But I definitely don't think they control owls and make them land just so you see them and it's real synchronistic for you. I find that a little ridiculous. And he goes on further to talk with Micah Hanks, and they're talking about abductions, and he says that the pop culture, like UFO stuff that they would play on like Unsolved Mysteries or Unexplained Mysteries, some UFO shows like that, doesn't represent the alien abduction phenomena to a very good light, right? So it's not demonstrating the alien abduction phenomena as a whole, it's just Hollywood-tized. So it's not the same. Well, I find that not to be the case in a lot of abductions. There are some oddities, but not all of them are woo-woo. So that's why I make this argument still. So, there's a pretty good made-for-TV series. It's actually a movie titled Intruders, and it's based after Intruders by Bud Hopkins. Now, It's a pretty good representation of the alien abduction phenomena. Now, it's not based entirely off the book, but if you watch that movie, that is your typical alien abduction. There's not, there are some oddities to it, right? But not in every case. Sometimes people have the typical Betty and Barney Hill case, where they're simply taken, shown things, tested, shown babies, put back. I realize Betty and Barney Hill weren't shown babies, but you get what I'm saying with this. Now, at one point in said podcast, he was explaining how Bud Hopkins would. I don't remember if it was that same episode, but he explained how Bud Hopkins would write all of this off, right? So, like these weird cases, he would just say, no, this isn't true. Or, I tried to look at the accumulative data. Well, that's what you're supposed to do. Like, even though I'm taking a look at the Ouija board cases, right? That's not the case in most, scenarios. There's not a Ouija board involved. In a few odd cases, there are. Which, I don't know. But the point is, what he was trying to say is he doesn't write them off. He waits for a larger pool of data to accumulate. So that rather than 15 cases, you've got 200 people reporting the same thing. Now, I know he wasn't bagging on Bud Hopkins too much there, but to a certain degree he was. Now, I wanted to clarify that, because that's what I took away from what he explained Bud Hopkins was saying. Now, much like the Ouija board cases, that's what I do too. In this case, I'm not going to write them off. I'm going to take them as a possibility. But I'm also going to put them on the back burner because that's not a regular thing. I'm going to stick with the normal alien abduction phenomena. Now, I'll give you a good example of people and their interpretations and sometimes making things up, which may or may not be the case. On Mysterious Universe, they have this running gag story, at least one of them, where there was a farmer in a field, I believe, and some aliens touch down, and there's this ball of light, and out of nowhere, a Bigfoot starts walking up to it, or it's their Bigfoot or something like that, and the alien tells him, don't touch the ball of light, and he touches the ball of light and almost, ooh, and then blows up. It's them being able to make fun of Bigfoot, but somebody actually reported that. Now, that's a weird, out there case. That's not something that we should take into account until there's more people validifying that, rather validating that. So, in other words, some people make things up. Not in all cases. Hell, maybe not even in most cases. But people shouldn't just be written off. So, again, back to Bud Hopkins, you put it on the back burner until you have more people reporting the same thing. That was his goal. He didn't take a Nick Redfern or a Micah Hanks. Well, Micah Hanks doesn't really do that. A Mike Cleland viewpoint of things, where it has to be paranormal, and I'm seeing synchronicities everywhere. Men in Black, Black-Eyed Kids, they're all the same. Cryptozoology. Let's link it together. Now, we can start this debate up again next time if you guys want, like, during a further long episode. I want to move on from this. I want to tell some actual alien abduction stories like Pat's, or some other ones from some of the books I have. I realize I'm not the best reader, so that part kind of screws it up a little bit, but this is what I do. I'm showing you some odd cases. And the interpretation of some of these other 4TN guys, as we're going to call them, or even ufologists. If Nick Redfern read some of these or heard some of these, man, he is jumping to the occult on it. That is a fucking fact. The first case, she saw an orange ball of light, or a little ball of light. He's going to go, well, why would it be that, rather than a ghost? Well, because in the 1980s, abductees in Britain were reporting the same thing. Let's take the second case. Well, why would UFOs have appeared? Well, they could be tracking the energy. It could be simply psychic phenomena. It could be a poltergeist. It could be technology. It could be so many things other than just paranormal in connection with the UFO. The UFO may have been a coincidence. It doesn't seem that way, but it could have been. And then in Pat's case, with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. Well, why couldn't that have actually been Jesus? Well, it wouldn't be Jesus. It does not seem to be. And if you look at the accumulative work that Dr. Carla Turner does, you will see that. Because she demonstrates that time and time again. Please excuse my crappy Nick Redfern interpretation. And again, I'm not the best at reading, okay? And I don't take these word for word other than their quotes. I kind of try to make it a little... I put it into my own words with exclusion of quotes from them. Now, I do want to clarify, I'm not bagging Mike Clelland by any means. I just think maybe he looks into things a little more than he should. He's done some great work. But at the same time, some of those synchronicities he's talking about, and he'll admit it himself if you listen back to the Grayling Report with him on there. I realize it's called something else now, but this is an older one from his podcast, Hidden Experience Audio. If you listen back to it, he even thinks that they could possibly be coincidences. And when I was listening to them, that's what I thought. Now again, I'm not trying to bag him, Nick Redfern, to put it in his terms. Frankly, I don't give a damn. Okay, I give a shit less. If I ever meet that man in one of these conferences, we're going to debate at that fucking table, and I'm telling you that right now. Because he's more of a paranormal guy rather than a ufologist. He has to link it all together, and I don't like that. Now again, there are many others that have done that too, and if they were still alive, I'd do it to them too. That's Brad Steiger. That's John Keel. I would debate all of them. Because I'm sorry. Now, I love the X-Files, but we don't live in an X-Files world where everything is connected. You don't take all of these things and then loop them in together, unless there are actual facts to it. And quite frankly, there doesn't seem to be. And we can take Pat again, right? As a good example of this. She's 11 at the time, so they've been taking her a long time. They know what she's thinking. They know what she likes. It's going to make it that much easier for her to go. That's just one example. It's easier for you to be taken if you think that you're seeing Jesus. Because she's very religious. So again, I'm going to end it here. Next week, we'll go into some kind of Halloween episode. Obviously, I'm going to start working on it today. And we're going to go into Pat's story a little more, too. Like I said, we're going to make Taken a weekly thing. And maybe we'll work into the Fringe eventually, and even Masquerade of Angels. All Dr. Harwood Turner work. We'll do a little segment each week where I tell part of the story. But I'm going to try to come up with a good Halloween episode for you guys. And if you have any suggestions, hit me up. You can find me on Facebook, The UFOs. Want to tell you something? If you want to email me, talk to me about your story, come on the podcast, tell me your story. It's theufos@yahoo.com. And again, I want to thank the Ghoulies for the badass intro and outro music. Follow them on Facebook, subscribe to them on YouTube, and check them out. Alright guys, I'm going to get out of here. Keep kicking it.